She looked me over like I was a dusty painting. Her gaze started at my neckline, trailed to the faded seams, and landed on the threadbare hem like it was a joke I'd missed. She laughed softly, not out loud, not for the table, but just for me, like a secret, like cruelty wrapped in pearls. Then she reached for her champagne glass and said maybe next time I could wear something age-appropriate. The whole table chuckled, light as feathers, sharp as glass. I felt it split the soft part of my chest. I went on about investments and Pilates instructors. I picked at a dry croissant. I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. It didn't used to be like that. Once upon a time, she held my pinky finger with her whole hand and called it magic. I'd press her school uniforms crisp and warm, tucking little notes in the sleeves. She used to sit on the edge of my bed just to talk, even after she had her own room with purple walls and posters of girls with microphones and glitter hair. Back then, I was needed in the way sunlight is needed, never thanked, but always wanted. I remember birthdays when she'd insist on my carrot cake, messy curls and candle wax on her fingers. And I remember the way she'd find my hand when we crossed parking lots, even when she was 12 and too old for that. I was her shelter. Her voice on bad days, her ride to band practice, her only constant when her father left. I took on both roles without applause, without complaint. But slowly, like dusk creeping over a porch, the calls shortened. The visits became strategic. I went from being asked for advice to being asked not to give any. I remember one dinner, they were all talking about some trip to Florence, and when I asked who watched the kids, my daughter said they had it handled. No need to worry myself. I smiled through salad. It was the first time I realized I hadn't even been asked. Then came the silence that sounded polite. Too busy. Rest, Mom. Don't tire yourself, she said. I should stay off my feet more. The words were sweet, but they floated with distance. My friends noticed. Darlene stopped calling after I missed 2 lunches. I hadn't missed them. I just hadn't been told. Messages went missing. Birthdays skipped. One day, the mail came late and the voicemail was empty, and I stood in the kitchen wondering if I had done something. Anything. One afternoon, I heard them talking in the next room. I hadn't meant to listen. I was just coming down the hall, but I stopped when I heard my name. Something about assets, about moving things early before she forgot. The phrase was said like a forecast, before she forgets. I didn't understand all of it, just that they weren't talking about keeping me safe. They were talking about keeping what was mine. I waited until they left and then opened the drawer where the bills were kept. Things looked different. Envelopes missing? A folder I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and sat at the table. Legal letters, a notarized form, my name, my daughter's signature. They had started moving ownership of things, not just my home, but investments, accounts I'd built from decades of tiny, tired deposits. I ran my finger over the line where they'd written that I had agreed. I never had. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid on my side, staring at the faint outline of the curtains, feeling something heavy and unfamiliar take shape in me. Not panic, not yet, but a growing clarity. Like fog lifting from a coastline I hadn't seen in years. The next morning, I called a woman named Karen. She'd done my taxes once, years ago. I remembered her being quiet and kind, with sharp eyes. I asked if we could talk. I brought her everything. The folder, the names, the letter where they said I'd authorized the transfer. She read in silence, nodding. Then she looked at me and said softly, "You didn't sign this, did you?" I shook my head, and that was the first time someone believed me. The days after were a quiet storm. Karen brought in someone else, an estate attorney. We began collecting things, real ones, not memories, but documents. Emails, a video of me from 3 months ago, reading aloud, balancing a checkbook, moving through my day. They wanted to paint me as confused, but I wasn't confused. I was just kept in the dark. I remember sitting in their living room one last time. My daughter brought up brunch again, said maybe next time I'd like help picking something. Her tone was syrupy. I looked at her face, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. I told her I had found the documents. Her eyes didn't blink. She just sighed. Said I was misreading things again, misremembering, that it wasn't what I thought. That word, again, hung in the air like smoke. It was a mask sliding down. I saw it all in her face. The planning, the control, the assumption that I would fold. I didn't. I hired someone to reappraise my assets. I signed a new will. I froze the accounts. I revoked the permissions they'd quietly filed under my name. And when it was time, when they tried to move forward in court to prove I needed managing, I showed up. I wore the diamonds. They weren't new. They were my mother's, given to me after she passed. I hadn't worn them in years, but they shimmered on my neck like a spine, like a memory that hadn't been erased. I stood in front of the judge with the documents in my hand and my voice. Steady. The lawyer read out everything. My daughter sat with her arms crossed, blinking fast. It was not a scene. It was not revenge. It was proof. Afterward, I bought a small home 2 towns over. 1 floor, light blue shutters. I kept the porch swing, planted marigolds in the soil behind the gate, changed my phone number, left no forwarding address except for the attorney. I cook for one now. I walk every morning. I still wear my old dress sometimes. But the diamonds are in the top drawer, not for showing off, but for remembering. Freedom tastes like silence with no tension, like tea steeped in peace. It's like no one's standing over you waiting for you to forget. She wasn't always like that. If anyone tells you people can't change, they haven't watched their own child slowly harden. I did. I saw it year after year. Like layers of frost forming where once there was spring. I used to know her, truly know her. Not just her favorite foods or what made her laugh, but the rhythm of her, the way her voice would tremble when she was excited, how she'd always tug at her sleeves when she was nervous. I knew which dreams haunted her and which ones gave her hope. I knew all of it, like only a mother can. She was soft, once. Gentle in ways that used to make strangers smile at the grocery store. I remember her as a teenager, insisting on packing me a snack if I had a long shift at the diner. She'd scribble little notes and tape them to my thermos lid things, like, "Hang in there, Supermom," in her terrible bubbly handwriting. I kept one of those notes in my wallet until it faded, and maybe that's why it hurt the way it did. Because I hadn't raised her to be cruel. I gave up a lot for her. Say that? Without bitterness now, but it was true. I walked away from things, invitations, promotions, dreams that had my name stitched quietly into them because she needed me, and I never once regretted it. Not when I was mopping floors at night while she slept. Not when I chose groceries over new shoes. Not when I missed sleep for 3 straight days when she had that fever at 6 years old and I thought I would break from the fear of it. All of that was part of being a mother, and I wore it like a badge. Not one anyone could see, but I felt it, a warmth in my chest that came from knowing I was doing right by her. The shift started slowly. At first it was small things. She stopped asking for my advice, then started rolling her eyes when I offered it. She got busier, I understood, or I told myself I did. Marriage, motherhood, work, it was a full plate. I told myself she still loved me, even if she forgot to call for weeks. I told myself I was being dramatic, too sensitive, too needy, but there were moments I couldn't explain away. One day I showed up with soup after she had the flu. I knocked on the door holding a basket of warm things, homemade broth, soft bread, and a jar of honey I'd tucked a sprig of thyme into. I heard voices inside, laughter, the sound of forks against plates. I waited. Finally, she came to the door, barely cracked it open. Said it wasn't a good time, maybe next week. I saw over her shoulder a dinner party. Candles, wine glasses, guests in neat clothes. My basket felt heavy all of a sudden. She smiled like nothing was wrong. Like I was just a well-meaning neighbor who didn't understand boundaries. I left the soup on the porch and that became a pattern, me arriving with something gentle. Her turning it away with a smile that said I was embarrassing, that I didn't belong. There was the time she changed the passcode to the garage and didn't tell me. I'd used that garage for years to store my extra linens and tools, all with her permission, of course. When I asked, she said it must have been the system resetting and she'd meant to call. But the way she said it, distracted, slightly annoyed, made it clear. She didn't really want me in the house anymore. Then came the photos. She posted a picture online from a birthday brunch. The same brunch where she'd laughed at my dress, the one with the faded roses that I used to wear to church on Sundays. In the photo, I'd been cropped out. Everyone else was there, her husband, the kids, even his parents. But not me. When I asked about it, she waved it off, said the lighting wasn't good on my side of the table, said not everything was about me. That stuck in my ribs longer than I'd like to admit. Not everything is about you. It was the way she said it. Like I'd tried to steal something. It's like I was the problem now. Just for noticing I was being quietly erased. It wasn't just her. Her husband began calling me by my first name instead of Mom or Mrs. Salim. That switch happened almost overnight. I remember the first time he did it, I was holding their newborn, rocking slowly, humming a lullaby I once sang to my daughter. He walked in and said in a clipped tone, Adila, could you not do that? She's sleeping. Like I was a guest who had crossed some line later. I mentioned it to my daughter, said maybe it was just me. But I missed being called Mom. She shrugged and said it was probably just more comfortable for him. That I shouldn't take it personally, but I did. 'Cause it was personal. It was all personal. Every oversight. Every unreturned message, every time they made a decision and told me afterward like I was the neighbor they forgot to invite, but figured wouldn't mind. I started writing things down in a little blue notebook I kept by the armchair. Dates, phrases, small indignities. It's not because I planned to use them. It's because I needed to prove to myself I wasn't imagining it. My world had been shrinking. And I didn't know it until I could no longer stretch my arms out without hitting the cold wall of her silence. Sometimes I'd sit on the edge of my bed at night, the house too quiet, and wonder if I had done something unforgivable. I'd play back old conversations, try to locate the exact moment things had shifted. As if pain could be solved like a riddle. But there was no moment, only accumulation, and the feeling that I'd been gently moved aside like an old vase, still part of the decor, but no longer touched. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to feel real again. Wanted to be seen not as a fragile inconvenience, but as a person. A mother. A woman who still had her name in mind and memories. I didn't know then what I would do, but I knew this much. I wouldn't keep waiting for her to notice. I had noticed. And that would have to be the beginning of everything. It's strange how silence can teach you. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that hums in the garden after rain or settles into an afternoon nap. No, this silence was heavier. A silence with corners, with a presence. It pressed itself against me each day, like it was waiting for me too. There was a time when my phone used to ring every morning. Not always for big things. Sometimes just a question about the grocery list, or if I remembered the name of that teething gel she liked as a baby. And then slowly, the calls shifted. They weren't for connection anymore. They were for convenience. Could I pick up the kids? Could I drop off the keys? Could I stay home because the plumber was coming? And when the favors stopped being useful, the calls stopped altogether. I used to find excuses for it. She's busy. She's tired. The kids need her attention. But those excuses started to fray. I'd see her posting photos with her friends, going to lunches, planning weekend trips. Things she never mentioned to me. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my tea, always lukewarm by the time I noticed it, and stare at the screen like I was watching someone I used to know. One night, after a particularly lonely day, I tried calling her. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again the next evening. time it rang once, then clicked. After a while, I stopped trying altogether. I didn't want to be the woman who chased her daughter through a phone line like a child tugging a sleeve. It was around. Then that the mail started coming late. At first, I thought I was just forgetful. But bills were missing. Statements I used to receive stopped arriving. And when I asked her about it, she smiled and said she'd just gone digital for me so I wouldn't have to worry about all the paper. I should be grateful, she said. That she was keeping track, grateful. It settled bitterly in my mouth. One afternoon, I went to the mailbox and found a letter, addressed to me but already opened. The envelope was tucked back like nothing had happened. I recognized the sender. It was from the utility company. When I looked closer, I saw that the address had been changed. Not completely, but slightly altered, enough to root things somewhere. Else first, that night, I searched the kitchen drawers for the little accordion folder where I kept important papers. Birth certificate, savings account numbers, pension documents. But when I pulled it out, it was thinner than I remembered, too. Of the envelopes were missing. I checked again, slower this time, as if that would change anything. I found a printed form at the back and account authorization. It had a signature on it. My name, in ink, that didn't look like my hand. I just stared at it and then something in me shifted. Not a panic, not a scream. Something quieter, deeper. A voice I hadn't listened to in years. Look closer, it said, so I did. The next morning, I called the bank. I told them I wanted to review my recent activity and verify authorized users. There was a long pause on the line, and then the voice returned, carefully composed. Yes, they said there had been updates to the account. Access granted to her name, her husband's, a financial planner I didn't recognize. The words came in pieces. Reallocation, consolidation, durable authority. That last one sat on my shoulders like a stone. Durable authority. A term that implied I could no longer manage my own life. I ended the call and sat very still. My hands were cold, but I wasn't shaking. My mind wasn't cloudy. I wasn't confused. I was aware, painfully so. Aware that I had been slowly rewritten. My decisions reframed as forgetfulness. My independence labeled as fragility. Later that week, I went by the pharmacy to pick up my medication. I was told there was a new note on my file that my daughter had updated some preferences, including auto-refill shipments and contact permissions. I asked to see the form. They hesitated, but eventually showed me the digital screen. My name. Her handwriting. I walked home that day slower than usual. Not because I was tired, I wasn't, but because I needed the air. I needed to let the truth settle into me fully. I needed to look at it without blinking. She had been making changes in the background. Quiet ones. Legal ones. Maybe even irreversible ones if I hadn't noticed in time. And I wondered, when had she started seeing me as someone to manage instead of someone to love? Was it when I forgot to return a call? When I started using a cane now and then? When I said no to babysitting because my knees ached and I needed rest? Or had it started long before that, in some quiet room in her mind, where she began measuring my worth against my usefulness? I didn't want to believe it. Even then, even with all the evidence laid out like broken china, I kept searching for a reason. For some thread of kindness that might have been misunderstood. For some version of her that hadn't let go of me entirely. But that version didn't answer the phone. She didn't check in. She didn't ask how I was. She only corrected me, redirected me. Softly, with concern in her voice, concern that wasn't for me. But for how neatly I stayed in the box she'd begun building. I sat by the window that evening and wrote everything down in my little blue notebook. Dates, names, changes. Memory wasn't failing. I had proof now. Not just on paper, but in my body, in my bones. A mother knows when something is being taken, and not just the house, or the money, or the passwords, but the right to exist as herself. And still, I didn't rage. I didn't scream. I made tea. I folded the laundry. I listened to the wind move through the old tree outside, but in the quiet. I began to plan, not for revenge, for remembrance, for restoration. I wasn't going to let them finish the story they had started writing without me. I still had a pen of my own, and I had just picked it up. The first person I told was myself. I said it out loud, alone in the kitchen, just to hear it spoken into the air. I think they're trying to take something from me. Not just things. Me. The kettle had just clicked off, and the house was full of that soft hush that comes in the early evening. I sat down slowly, the blue notebook open in front of me, and underlined the last sentence I'd written. Pharmacy file changed. Bank access transferred. Signature mismatched. I stared at it for a long time. The ink looked firm, certain. Not like someone confused. Not like someone fading. The next morning I made a list. Not a list of what to do I wasn't ready for that yet, but of what I still had. It was something Karen, the woman who did my taxes years ago, had once told me in passing back when I was panicking over a minor investment loss. She said, when things start slipping, take inventory of what's still in your hands. You'll surprise yourself. So I wrote my name, my house still under my name. For now, my body tired, but my mind clearer than they think. My history, my memory, my voice. I was a short list, but every word felt like a reclaiming. That afternoon, I went looking for the dusty manila folder that held my old estate documents. It was tucked behind a stack of cookbooks, pages curling at the edges, heavy with neglect. I pulled it out like it might break apart in my hands. But it held Dot inside the will I'd signed 12 years ago. I remembered sitting across from a lawyer, younger then, still working part-time at the library, wanting to make sure my daughter would have everything she needed if anything ever happened. To me, I'd left it all to her. Without question, without a clause, without a witness to tell me not to be so generous. I looked at that paper now and felt coldness bloom under my collarbone. It wasn't just the money. It was the message I had given. Heard that my only worth would be passed along once I was gone. That while I was still here, I wouldn't need protection, or rights, or dignity. I had handed her the keys and told her not to drive off. And she had. So I found Karen's number again, tucked in an old contacts book. I called her the next day. Told her I had some questions about updates and authorizations and protections for myself this time, not for anyone else. Her voice was kind. She remembered me. She said come by whenever I was ready. I didn't rush. It took me a few days, just to gather everything. The documents, the questions, the courage, because some part of me still hesitated. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was breaking something sacred. The idea that a daughter will always love her mother, that the bond can bend but never snap. I had to admit that the snapping had already happened. Karen listened quietly as I explained. She didn't interrupt, just nodded, clicked her pen, and took notes. When I showed her the form with the forged signature, her mouth pressed into a firm line. She didn't say it right away, but I could tell she knew what I already feared, that this was bigger than an overstep. It was a plan, a soft legal removal, one that had been happening in small, quiet motions for a while. One I wasn't meant to notice until it was done. We made a plan together. Nothing loud, nothing rushed, just steps. First, secure the accounts. Then, reassign the mail. Then, revoke permissions. Then, update the will. Each item we ticked off made me feel a little taller. Karen introduced me to someone else, a woman named Nadia, an attorney who specialized in elder protections. She didn't speak to me like I was a case. She asked about my garden, about my knees, about how I slept. I told her the truth. Not well, but better now that I was doing something. She asked if I felt safe. I said yes, because I did. I still lived alone. No one had threatened me. But something in her eyes told me that wasn't always the case with her clients. We filed paperwork that week. I left the offices with a folder of my own, not full of things people had taken, but things I had chosen. My name at the top of each form. My initials in every margin. For the first time in a long while, I felt real again. Like a person with substance, not someone waiting to disappear. Still, there was one thing I couldn't shake. I hadn't confronted her. Not really. I hadn't looked her in the eye and asked the question sitting heavy in my chest. Why? Why do this to me? Why decide I was done before I said I was? Why trade love for control? The chance came without warning. She stopped by one Saturday. Morning, no call, no warning. Just knocked once and let herself in with the spare key I had foolishly never reclaimed. She held a plant apiece, Lily, like a gift. I hadn't seen her in weeks. She smiled too wide and said something about wanting to reconnect. That she'd been so busy and maybe we should do lunch soon. I looked at the plant, its leaves were drooping, the soil dry. I led her to the kitchen, sat across from her. Said, I needed to ask something, and she blinked, slow and cautious. I asked about the signatures, the accounts, the pharmacy file. I didn't raise my voice, but didn't accuse. She sipped from her water glass like it might help her stall. Then she said, maybe I was misremembering. Maybe I had agreed at some point. That I'd mentioned once that it was all too much and she was just trying to help. She didn't sound like someone apologizing. She sounded like someone defending an investment. When I said I'd contacted a lawyer, her face tightened. Just slightly. But I saw it, the mask slipping for a breath. She said I was overreacting, that it didn't have to be messy, that families could work through things without dragging in strangers. I looked at her and said I wasn't dragging anyone. I was rising. She didn't like that. She left soon after. Forgot the plant. I kept it. I watered it, and it bloomed 3 weeks. Later, tall, stubborn, luminous white, the bloom opened on a Thursday morning. I had just set down my tea, lukewarm as always, when I caught the flicker of white at the edge of the table. The lily, the one she'd brought like an afterthought, a prop in some rehearsed apology, had opened. A single clean flower. Bold. As a confession, I leaned in to look at it more closely. Its edges were smooth, perfect. Not a tear or mark on the petals. I touched the stem lightly with the back of my finger and thought, you survived, too. The house was quiet, and for once, it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like clarity. I spent that whole morning cleaning. Not a spring sort of cleaning. Not the frantic kind. This was something slower, intimate. A ritual. I opened drawers and let go of things that didn't belong to me anymore. Not just old scarves or unused appliances, but stories I'd been holding on to that weren't true. Guilt, blame, the heavy idea that maybe I'd done something to deserve the distance. The soft fear that perhaps I wasn't enough anymore. I let them go. I dusted off picture frames and moved the ones that didn't feel honest. There was one photo her wedding day where I'd been cropped in the frame, barely visible on the edge. I took it down and slid it into the drawer without ceremony. I left up a different one instead. Her at 6 years old, missing a tooth, wearing a homemade butterfly costume. I'd stitched the wings myself. She had been proud. She'd twirled for me in the hallway, calling herself the queen of the garden. That little girl wasn't the woman who sat in my kitchen and rewrote the truth, but I still loved her. That's the hardest part to explain to anyone, how love can stay even when trust leaves. How memory clings to the versions of people who no longer exist. I spent the next few weeks moving deliberately. I updated documents, changed the locks, canceled joint authorizations. Each step was small but decisive. Nadia helped me file for a formal revocation of powers she had taken without proper consent. There were hearings being scheduled, letters being exchanged. The wheels of the law moved slowly, but they moved. I wrote everything down, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew they did. Karen called one afternoon to say the financial reversals had been accepted, that her access had been suspended, that her name no longer had control. I stood by the kitchen sink, phone in hand, and exhaled something I didn't know I was holding. A sound that came from the ribs, deep and weary. Not relief. Not yet. But something close. That night, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for no reason. A dusty Merlot from a grocery store sale 5 years back. I poured one glass, sliced some cheese, sat on the porch, and listened to the sound of nightbirds. I didn't toast to anything, just sat with it, the feeling of being returned to myself. Around that time, her husband called me. Not her. Him, it was Kurt. Measured, he asked if we could all sit down and talk things through as a family. I asked plainly, "What exactly do you want to talk through?" He said something about misunderstandings, bad intentions, about how none of this had to escalate. I stayed quiet long enough that he had to fill the silence. He added that she was hurt, that she didn't understand why I was reacting this way, that she was doing her best. I told him I was sure she believed. And then I told him I wouldn't be speaking without my lawyer present anymore. He scoffed, said that sounded ridiculous. I said, "Up to me." I hung up gently. That was the last time I spoke to either of them for weeks. In their silence, I began to feel something unexpected, room inside my own life. Hours that belonged only to me. A day where I could choose what I wore without fearing someone's sideways glance. A table where I could set out toast and fruit, and not be judged for the simplicity of it. I returned to things I had left behind. My sketchbook, my poetry. I found a stack of half-written stanzas in the hall closet, tucked behind a sewing basket. Words I hadn't finished. Lines waiting for breath. I walked down to the library again, signed up for the senior writing group. They meet on Tuesdays in the back room near the dusty nonfiction section. No one there knows my daughter. No one there asks me what I'm doing about the situation. They ask what I'm writing. They ask if I want sugar in my tea. They ask how I'm sleeping. It's strange how healing can feel so small. Just a kind word, a slow morning. The choice to leave the curtains open, but that's how it came in. Pieces. One afternoon, I received a letter, official, stiff paper, a hearing date. A court proceeding to finalize the revocation of guardianship rights they had quietly filed. The envelope shook a little in my hands as I opened it, but not out. Of fear, it was shaking with weight. With truth, I circled the date on the calendar in red. I pressed the pen harder than I meant to, left a dent in the paper. I stared at it for a moment. Then I walked to the bedroom, opened the top drawer, and touched the velvet pouch where my mother's diamonds sat. I wouldn't wear them for show. I would wear them for presents, not to be seen, but to see myself fully, without apology. The lily bloomed again that night. Another bud unfurling, slow and certain. And I stood by the window, watching it, knowing something had begun. The red circle on the calendar became a kind of horizon. Every day that passed brought it closer, and with it, a quiet shift inside me. Not nerves exactly, but a kind of stretching, a preparation. Like I was growing into the woman I needed to be for that room. I didn't dread it. That surprised me. I thought I'd feel fear rising like smoke, but it never came. What came instead was steadiness. A calmness that lived deep in the chest, not in the hands. I still made tea. I still watered the plants. But now I stood straighter when I did. I kept a list of what I'd bring. The documents, the letters, the records. A copy of the original will. A statement from Karen. Notes from my doctor, just as a precaution. Not because I needed to prove my mind, but because they might say I did. They always say that. When a woman past a certain age starts defending herself, she must be confused. She must be tired. She must be forgetting. But I wasn't forgetting. I remembered everything. I remembered the morning I found out my husband had left for good. My daughter was 11. I made pancakes anyway. I remembered how I sold my wedding ring to pay the heating bill that winter. I remembered how I took night shifts cleaning office buildings just to keep her in private school when she begged not to be transferred. I remembered it all. If memory was the test, I passed with distinction. I didn't tell many people about the hearing, not out of shame, but because this wasn't a spectacle, was something being repaired. Quietly with care, still I needed Someone to stand beside me, not a witness for the court, but a witness for me. So I called Layla. She used to live down the street before she moved to the smaller unit behind her son's house. We hadn't spoken in months. That's what happens. Sometimes when grief takes over, you retreat. But when I heard her voice, it was like breath finding lungs again. I told her just enough. Not every detail. It's just that I needed someone who knew who I really was. She said she'd be there. No hesitation. She even offered to drive the night before the hearing. I sat on the porch and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. The air was still. The trees were bare, but not lifeless. I thought of all the rooms I had stood in as a mother, as a woman who had been doubted, as a woman who had been needed and then pushed aside tomorrow. I would walk into one more room, but this time I wouldn't walk in carrying apology. I laid out my clothes carefully, a dark navy skirt, soft cotton, a blouse with buttons that I pressed myself, and the necklace, my mother's diamonds, simple and small, but steady as stars. I placed them beside my papers like an anchor. Sleep came in pieces that night. Not restless, just shallow. My body was rehearsing, remembering the weight of my truth. In the morning, I rose early, bathed, made eggs and toast, ate slowly. Layla arrived right on time, her gray scarf looped twice around her neck, smile warm and sure. She didn't ask if I was ready. She didn't need to at the courthouse. Everything was beige. The walls, the chairs, the faces of strangers waiting to be called, but I didn't feel invisible. I felt present. My daughter was already there. She sat with her husband, flipping through something on his phone. She wore a sleek black suit and heels too high for comfort. When she saw me, her face froze for a beat. Just a breath. Then the mask returned, polite, composed, unreadable. We didn't speak. The hearing itself was quiet. Procedural, almost. The judge asked questions, and I answered plainly. Karen provided the documents. Nadia explained the discrepancies. They tried to interrupt once, her husband, mostly, but the judge raised his hand for silence. I spoke. Clearly, I said what had happened, what had changed, what I had found. I didn't accuse, I didn't cry. And then I read from my notebook just one entry the day. Found my signature forged. The courtroom was silent when I finished. My daughter didn't meet my eyes. When the judge ruled, restoring my sole authority, revoking their access, freezing any future action without my explicit consent, it felt less like victory, more like a return, as if the floor had been reset beneath my feet. We left quietly. Layla squeezed my hand once in the hallway and said, "You looked like yourself in there." And I did, at home. I placed the documents in the manila folder, the one that used to be hidden, now kept in plain sight. I removed the wedding photo from the drawer, not to display it again, but to say goodbye to that version of her, to that version of me. Later that evening, I took off the necklace and placed it gently in its box. Not with sadness, with reverence that the house was warm. The tea was sweet. I looked at the lily. A third bloom had opened. Sometimes survival isn't loud. It's not a speech or a slam of the door. Sometimes it's a quiet re-entry. A woman stepping back into her name, into her life. I wasn't broken. I was simply returned. That night, after the hearing, I didn't sleep for a long time. But it wasn't the usual restlessness, the kind that loops worry through your mind until the hours vanish. It was something quieter, something closer to stillness. I lay there beneath the blanket, the house hushed around me, and I let myself feel the shape of what I'd done. I had protected myself. That may sound simple. Maybe it even sounds obvious, like something a person should just do. But for women like me, mothers like me, it doesn't come naturally. We're taught to give, to absorb, to soften our tone, to apologize before anyone even asks us to. We make ourselves small in service of love, thinking that love will keep us safe. I used to believe that. Now I know that love without respect is just a softer word for control. The morning after the hearing, I stepped out onto the porch and stood, barefoot on the cold wood. The sun was low, still undecided. But the sky had that pale winter blue, the kind that makes you feel wide awake. I held the railing with both hands and breathed deeply. I wasn't the same woman who had stood here a month ago, and I wasn't trying to be the woman I used to be. EITHER. I was someone entirely different now. Not new, just surfaced. Over the next few days, I kept to myself. I answered a few calls from Karen and Nadia. I sent a thank you letter to the clerk who had helped me file everything. I didn't hear from my daughter. Not a word. Not a text. Nothing from her husband either. But the silence didn't carry the same sting it once did. I didn't need to be chosen anymore. I had chosen myself. I started cleaning out the guest bedroom. Not because I expected visitors, but because it had become the room I avoided. Her room, once. Then later, the one where they'd leave bags without asking, dump laundry, toss things they no longer wanted but didn't have the heart to throw out. I used to keep it intact for her as if she might one day return to that younger version of herself. Knock on the door with flowers and call me mommy again. But I didn't believe in that kind of return anymore. I emptied the closet, boxed up old blankets, cleared the bookshelf of paperbacks she never took with her when she moved out. I found a sweater at the back, one I'd knitted when she was 16. She had worn it once, called it itchy. Left it behind when she went to college. I folded it neatly and placed it in a donation bag, not with bitterness, just with release. I opened the windows and let the room breathe again. That afternoon, I found a voicemail waiting. Short. A woman's voice, clipped and unfamiliar. She introduced herself as a notary representative from a local estate firm. She said she had tried to contact me earlier, but my daughter had listed herself as my primary contact and had blocked communications. Her tone was neutral, almost mechanical. But I knew what it meant. There had been more plans, more quiet movements made in my name without my knowing. She said she was calling to confirm that all future communications would now go directly through me. And she had updated the files to reflect that. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the kitchen counter where the phone sat. My palms were open, no trembling, just air and truth between my fingers. Even now, weeks after the hearing, things were still unwinding, still surfacing. That's how betrayal works sometimes. It ripples long after the stone is thrown, but I no longer felt surprised or shaken. I felt solid. After dinner, I walked to the backyard with a basket of kitchen scraps for the compost. Soft with frost. The marigolds had long withered, but I didn't mind. Even decay has beauty if you let it. There's a kind of quiet courage in things that bloom and fall in their own time. I passed the old swing set, rusted now, bare. Once. She'd begged for that swing, said she wanted to fly. I used to push her for hours, my hands cupping her back. Her laughter rising into the air like music. I stood there for a while, just stood. Let the cold move through me. Then I reached up and pulled the swing gently forward, just once, and let it go. It moved for a few seconds, then slowed. Stilled. The past had done what it came to do. And so had I back inside. I made tea and took it to the table with the blue notebook. I flipped through the pages, so many scribbled lines, some angry, some aching, all of them honest. I ran my fingers down the final page, then closed it. I didn't need to write in it anymore. I left it there on the shelf, not to forget, but to honor the woman who needed it. Because now, I was someone else, someone who could speak without fear. Someone who could sit alone in a house she owned fully, legally and spiritually, and feel not abandoned, but restored. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, that didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. About a week after the hearing, I received a card in the mail. No envelope, just a plain cream-colored card slipped into my mailbox like an afterthought. The handwriting was hers. I'd know it anywhere, still precise, still upright, as if afraid of slanting too far in any direction. Inside, only a few words. We should talk. No lawyers. Just us. No apology. No warmth. Just a tone that said, I had caused difficulty by refusing to be quietly erased. I placed the card on the kitchen table beside a cup of tea that had gone cold. For a long time, I just looked at it. I tried to imagine what she would say if we did meet. Would she call it a misunderstanding again? Would she shift the blame to her husband, to the paperwork, to the confusion of digital files and overzealous advisors? Would she say she was worried about me, that everything she did was out of love? And more importantly, would I still fall for it because for a long time I did? I mistook her control for concern, her avoidance for boundaries, her manipulation for a kind of love that just didn't know how to speak gently. But I knew better now. I folded the card and tucked it under the ceramic dish by the window, the one where I kept pebbles from my garden and old keys whose doors no longer existed. She wanted to meet, so I agreed. Not because I needed her explanation, but because I needed her to hear me. We met in a public cafe. Neutral ground. I wore the same navy skirt I had worn to the courthouse, though this time with a simple sweater and no diamonds. I didn't want symbols, I wanted clarity. She arrived late, purse slung over her shoulder, sunglasses still on even, though it was cloudy. She kissed the air beside my cheek and sat down across from me like we were two women catching up after a long time apart, as if something had simply drifted. Instead of been broken on purpose, she smiled tightly and said, I looked good. I said nothing back. We ordered drinks. She talked first. She said she was hurt, that she hadn't expected me to go so far. That things got twisted. That she had never intended to remove me from my own life. She just wanted to streamline things and reduce the stress. That I'd always been the strong one, and she didn't know how to manage watching me slow down. I listened. I stirred my tea, and when she finished, I asked her one question. Did you think I wouldn't notice? She opened her mouth, closed it again, took a long sip from her cup. She didn't answer, so I continued. I told her I had seen every step, every document, every change, every password update. I told her about the pharmacy, the utility bills, the bank accounts, about the conversations she thought I hadn't overheard, about the signatures she had rewritten. She sat there, stiff, silent. Her fingers tightened around her mug. I told her I didn't hate her. I wasn't here to shame her. But I wasn't here to protect her from the truth either. I told her I had trusted her with my whole life, and she had treated it like a project to be simplified, as if I was cluttered to be cleared. When I finished, I waited. She looked at me not as a daughter looking at her mother, but as a woman who had been caught. Then she said she was sorry, but it came out hollow. Not a warm sorry, not the kind that lands in the chest and stays. It was the kind people say when they want the conversation to end. I nodded once, stood up, and left my tea half full. I didn't look back. On the walk home, the sky broke open. A light rain, the kind that doesn't soak you but still makes you pull your coat tighter. I let it touch my face. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was simply done. That night, called Nadia and asked her to help me finalize a few more changes. We updated the deed on the house, listing my name with a private trust to protect against any future attempt to claim it. We secured my pension. We transferred my savings into a locked account, accessible only by me and a backup attorney, whose name they didn't know. And we changed the will. Not out of spite, out of wisdom, for years. I thought legacy meant giving everything to the person you loved most, regardless of whether they knew how to carry it. Now, I understood something deeper. Legacy is choosing what stays behind when you're no longer here and deciding who will. Protect it, not just spend it. I left the house to a foundation that helps older women fight elder abuse and exploitation. Exploitation. I included a letter with it sealed in the back of the new documents. Not a bitter letter. It's just the truth. The things I had learned the hard way. My daughter's name no longer appeared in the will. Neither did her husband's. I kept one thing of hers, though. A photograph from when she was little, the butterfly wings, the missing tooth. It lives in my bedroom now, on a small table beside a lamp. I don't keep it there to remember her. I keep it to remember me, the woman who gave everything. And then quietly took herself back. It wasn't long after that cafe meeting that the whisper started. Not from her, she stayed silent after. I walked out, but from the edges of the family. Cousin I hadn't heard from in years left me a voicemail full of stammering curiosity. An old friend from church sent a message asking if everything was all right. That she'd seen a funny post online but didn't want to pry. Funny post? I never saw it myself, but I could imagine. A vague caption. Something about how it's hard to help people who are stuck in the past. Maybe a few sympathetic comments from people who didn't know any better? Maybe a handful of hearts and hugs and platitudes that would float through the screen like comfort. But comfort for whom? It didn't matter. I didn't need to correct the story they were telling. I was writing my own now. Still, I knew enough to be cautious. Not paranoid, just deliberate. One step at a time, so I gathered what I needed, not just papers and passwords, but people. I called Miriam first. She used to work with me at the library, back when my hands could shelve books all day, and my knees. Didn't complain about stairs. She's the kind of woman who remembers birthdays, who notices the small things no one else does. We hadn't spoken in a while, but I knew I could trust her. She came over with pastries and a brown paper bag and a binder tucked under her arm. She didn't ask for details. Just listened as I poured tea and told her the truth. All of it. From the first forged signature to the final courtroom silence, her face didn't change much except around the eyes. There was a stillness in her, like someone watching a fire they couldn't put out but could at least name. She reached into her binder and pulled out a folder. Inside, information about an elder advocacy group she volunteered with part-time. Legal protections, financial literacy workshops, peer support. I hadn't known such a thing existed. I told her that. She smiled softly and said, "You're not alone, you know. More of us are waking up." That stuck with me. More of us are waking up. The next day, I visited the group's local office. Just a quiet building tucked between a dental clinic and a florist easy to miss if you weren't looking. Inside, soft chairs, framed prints on the wall. A bookshelf filled with pamphlets and binders that didn't look threatening or complicated. Steady. I met with a woman named Selma. She looked to be in her 50s, sharp-eyed and patient. I told her why I'd come. She didn't act surprised. She nodded at all the right places. When I finished, she said something I hadn't let myself believe until then. "You've done the hard part. Now you get to decide what comes next." That evening, I sat on the back step with a cup of chamomile and watched the sky turn pale orange. I thought about what Selma had said, about the quiet power of choice, not reaction, not defense, but creation. What comes next? I didn't want to just protect what was mine. I wanted to reshape it. The house. The documents. The money. Yes. Those things, but also the story of who I was now. I wasn't a mother waiting to be needed. I wasn't a woman proving she wasn't broken. I was someone who had survived a quiet war and lived to make her own map. I made a list again, not in the blue notebook. This time, on fresh paper, cream-colored thick. Find a lawyer to finalize the new trust, update beneficiaries again. To be sure, move small valuables to a safety deposit box. Sell what doesn't serve me. Write the letter, then. Letter, I'd been thinking about it since the hearing, not to her. That door was closed now. But to the ones who might come after? To the women who find themselves alone at a kitchen table, holding an envelope they didn't open, wondering when they stopped being seen. I wanted to tell them, you're not fading. You're being pushed, and you don't have to accept it. I wanted to tell them, you're allowed to fight for your own name. You're allowed to say no, even to your own child. You're allowed to love someone and protect yourself from them at the same time. So I started writing. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't angry, just true. A list of lessons, a recounting of facts, a soft-spoken survival guide. I printed 3 copies. One went into the foundation packet with my will. One into the group binder at Selma's office. She'd asked for a contribution. And one stayed with me, tucked into the back of a drawer beneath the peace lily, which had now bloomed again, its fourth. Things were shifting inside and out. I started calling the swing set repairman about taking it down. I cleared the pantry of things I no longer ate. I gave away coats I hadn't worn in years. I started referring to the guest room as the studio, even though I hadn't yet made art in it. The renaming was enough. And then one morning, I called Nadia again. I told her I was thinking of selling the house. She paused, asked if I was sure. I said yes, calmly, completely. It wasn't grief. It wasn't escape. It was evolution. I didn't want to stay rooted in a place where I had once been invisible, even if I had made myself visible again. I wanted something else, something new. The letter came folded in thirds, tucked into a business envelope with no return address. Inside was a notice, a formal inquiry from her husband's legal team. Something vague but sharp-edged, like a warning spoken through a smile. They were requesting clarification on my financial transfers, curious about my recent actions regarding shared family assets. It read like concern, but it wasn't it. Was a threat dressed as curiosity? I held the paper in my hand for a long time. Let the weight of it sit on my skin. Then I placed it beside my tea and called Nadia. She didn't seem surprised. They always come back, she said. When the curtain lifts and they can't control you quietly anymore. They try to pull you back onto the stage, their stage, where the story stays tidy and they hold the script. But I had taken my script back. We filed a response brief, precise, fortified with documents and timelines. We offered a meeting one time, in public. With legal advisors present, nothing more, they agreed. The restaurant was neutral ground, quiet place with linen napkins and soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. It's the kind of place you choose when you want to look civil while hiding sharpness beneath your coat. I arrived early. I wore a simple gray blouse and the diamonds, just a touch of them, sitting light at my collarbone. I ordered a glass of still water and waited with the folder in my lap. They arrived together, my daughter and her husband, walking side by side, arms not quite touching. She smiled faintly, like she thought we might start again from politeness. He didn't smile at all. Our lawyers were already seated. Nadia gave me a small nod, like a signal that I wasn't alone, that I had been seen. We didn't order food. No one wanted to pretend this was social. They asked questions, questions that were really statements. They wondered aloud whether I had been pressured into changing my estate plans, whether someone was misleading me, whether I was making decisions I might later regret. I let them speak. Let the room fill with their feigned concern and paper-thin courtesy. Then I opened my folder. Inside, the old documents and the new, the forged. Signature. The outdated will, the court ruling. The recorded medical clearance from my doctor, dated and signed, confirming full mental capacity. I laid each paper on the table one by one. Deliberate. Calm, she didn't touch them. He leaned forward, as if reading would make it easier to deny. When I finished, I looked at her, not through her, not above her. At her, and I said, softly, "You knew exactly what you were doing." She opened her mouth, but I raised my hand gently, not to silence her, but to finish what I had come to say. I told her I loved her. I told her I would always remember the little girl who wrapped her arms around my neck and called me her whole world. I told her that girl had saved me in more ways than I could count, that I had never regretted a single sacrifice. But, I also told her this: loving you does not mean surrendering to you. She blinked. Her hand twitched near the edge of the tablecloth, but she didn't speak. I turned to him and said, "You may know law, but you do not know love. And that is your weakness." Nadia placed the final letter in front of them, a cease and desist, outlining the boundaries I had now enforced. Any further interference would be met with litigation. They sat back. He muttered something about this being unnecessary. I said, "I agree. It never had to be this way." They left before the check came. Not that there was anything to pay for. I stayed behind, finished my water, and watched the window. Outside, the street glimmered in the wet light of early evening. Felt the stillness. Again, the one that had come after the hearing. But deeper now, rooted. When I stood, Nadia offered to walk me to my car. I thanked her but said no. I wanted to walk alone. That night, took the final step. I listed the house for sale. The realtor came in the morning, young and cheerful and not at all fazed by how long I'd lived there. I walked her through each room. Slowly, I showed her the patch on the wall where the old clock had hung. The notch in the banister from when my daughter had run too fast with a suitcase. The kitchen drawer that always stuck, unless you pulled it just right. She asked if I was sure. I said, absolutely. She smiled and said it would show well. Good bones, lots of light. That evening, I packed one small box, essentials only. It's a photo of the butterfly costume. My tea mug, the velvet pouch with the diamonds. A linen napkin I'd once embroidered with my mother's initials. I left the rest for movers. Not because I was rushing, but because I was light-free outside. The peace lily had bloomed again, 5th time this year. Stubborn thing, I smiled at. It whispered, "You're coming with me." I was ready. Not for escape, for arrival. The house sold faster than I thought it would. 3 days after the listing went up. A young couple made an offer. They had a toddler and a baby on the way. Said they loved the porch, the old swing set, the light in the back room. Said it reminded them of something they couldn't name but wanted to return to. I liked them immediately. Not because they were charming or polite, though they were both. But because they looked at the house the way I once did, like it held possibility, not just memory. I accepted the offer without a counter. It surprised the realtor. She asked if I wanted to hold out. For more. I said, more of what? Money was not what I needed. What I needed was motion. And so I began to let go. Piece by piece, I emptied the drawers. Some things I donated, coats, books, dishes, I no longer used. Some I mailed away, an old photo album to a cousin in Karachi, a music box to my childhood friend in Montreal. A few small things I sold, online just to feel the clean exchange. I kept only what I could carry without dragging. The movers came on a Thursday. They were gentle with everything, though I'd told them not to worry so much. I watched as they wrapped the last boxes in thick brown paper and loaded them into the truck. The final thing to leave was the peace lily. I carried it myself, tucked into the front seat beside me like a quiet witness stopped by evening. The house was empty. Echoes in the hallways. A hush that didn't feel sad. It's just finished. I stood in the doorway and ran my hand along the frame one last time. No ceremony, no speech, just breath. Then I turned the key in the lock and walked away. My new place was smaller, 1 floor. A front window that caught the morning light just right. No stairs, no swing set, no shadows. Just clean walls and space enough for what I had become. I unpacked slowly over the next few days. No rush. I put the photo of her butterfly wings, gap-toothed smile on the windowsill. I set the tea mug on the counter. The notebook. Now, closed for good, went on the top shelf of the closet. Not hidden, just honored. And I hung the embroidered napkin by the stove, a thread of the past, stitched into the present. The peace lily sat in the center of the room. Still blooming, I started new routines. Walks in the early morning when the air was still undecided. Quiet lunches in the park. Afternoons reading. Evenings writing letters I didn't need to send. I made friends slowly. The neighbor next door, her name was Brenda, brought over lemon bars on my second day. She had the kind of laugh that made you feel like you hadn't heard your own in too long. We talked about nothing and everything. Felt easy. Clean. She asked if I had kids. I said I had a daughter once. She didn't press. A week later, I joined the local library's writing circle. Just 5 of us, sitting in a sunlit room, passing pages like small offerings. No one knew my story. No one needed to. They knew my voice. That was enough. I wasn't pretending to be healed, but I was whole. One afternoon, as I walked home from the market, I passed a little antique shop tucked between two cafes. In the window was a silver frame. Not ornate, not flashy, just simple, elegant, unfinished. It stopped me. I walked in and asked to see it. The woman behind the counter handed it over carefully. I turned it in my hands and saw there was no backing yet, just the shape waiting to hold something. I bought it. I placed it on my desk at home. Empty. A reminder that not all frames have to be filled to be complete. A few days later, I received a letter, handwritten. No return address, but I knew the slant of it immediately. It was from her 2 pages. Careful words, some apology, though wrapped in disclaimers. Some explanation, though softened with ambiguity. She wrote that she had realized she may have gone too far, that she never intended to hurt me, that she hoped we could find our way back. She ended with, "You're still my mother." I read it once, folded it. I didn't write back, not because I hated her, but because I finally loved myself enough not to go backward. I placed the letter in a box in the closet, not with malice, with compassion. People like to think closure is about doors slamming, but it isn't. It's about walking past the door and realizing you don't need to open it anymore. That night, I sat by the window with the peace lily beside me. The moonlight touched its leaves. My tea was warm. My hands were steady. And for the first time in years, I felt not like someone waiting to be seen, but like someone who already was, by herself, fully, completely, without permission, without apology. It's a strange thing, freedom. You expect it to arrive like a trumpet, bold and unmistakable. But when it came for me, it didn't even knock. It just slipped in one morning while I was making oatmeal. The kettle hissed softly. A sparrow tapped against the window. I looked around my small kitchen, at the single mug drying on the rack. At the sunlight pooling across the floor tiles. I felt it. Freedom wasn't loud. It was gentle. It was the quiet knowing that no one could decide who I was anymore, not in conversation, not in paperwork, not in shadows. A few days later, I went to the post office and opened a new P.O. box, not because I needed one, but because I liked the idea that my mail, my messages, my words had their own place now. A locked little drawer with a key that only I carried. Afterward, I stopped by the bakery. The man behind the counter remembered my name. He asked how I liked the sourdough I'd bought last week. I told him it was perfect. He smiled without assumption, just kindness. I left with a fresh loaf and a cherry tart I hadn't planned on. That afternoon, I walked to the little park at the end of my street. There's a bench there that faces a small fountain, and on warm days, you can hear the water trickle like it's telling a secret. I sat with my tart and my tea in a thermos and just watched. No rush, no role to perform, no phone to check, no version of myself I had to prove worthy. A little girl ran past with a pinwheel, her mother trailing behind, laughing. The wind caught the pinwheel, and for a second it spun wildly, full of color and motion and sound. Then it slowed, still, and the girl ran on. That's what it felt like inside me. Something that had spun for too long finally coming to a stop. I went home and opened the closet. Not to organize it, not to clean it, just to take one thing out. The new deed, my name alone. No cosigners. No secondary authorizations, just mine. I ran my fingers over it, then placed it back into its folder. And on top of it, I set a small note I had written days earlier on crisp stationery. This life belongs to me, fully. Without negotiation, I didn't need anyone to read it. It was enough that I had written it later that week. I took the bus to the coast just for the day. I packed a sandwich, a scarf, a paperback I'd been meaning to read again. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not out of secrecy, just for the sweetness of moving without being tracked. I hadn't seen the ocean in over 20 years. When I stepped onto the sand, the wind curled around my ankles like it remembered me. The air smelled like salt and possibility. I took off my shoes and walked until my feet met the surf. The water was cold, but not unkind. I stood there, hem of my skirt damp, and looked out at the horizon. There was nothing to reach for, only something to stand in. I found a rock near the dunes and ate my sandwich. I watched seagulls argue over crumbs. I read half a chapter, then stopped. Not because I was tired, but because the sound of the waves was enough. And when I came home that night, the house greeted me without question. That's what I had been missing for so long. It's a place that didn't ask me to prove myself. A space where I wasn't a burden or a pawn, or a memory waiting to be softened. Just a woman in her chair with her tea in her name. The next morning, I passed the mirror on my way to the kitchen. I stopped, not to fix anything, not to frown, just to look. I took in the lines around my mouth, the silver in my hair, the slope of my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I didn't compare this reflection to an older one. I didn't ask what had been lost. I saw what had been kept. Stillness, strength, dignity. I smiled. A real one. The kind that starts behind the eyes and turned away. Not because I was finished looking, because I was ready to live. The next week, I bought a map, not a digital one. Not the kind that calculates routes and gives instructions in a voice that sounds vaguely disappointed. A real one, paper, folded into itself like a secret. I found it in a corner of the bookstore, behind a stack of outdated travel guides and postcards no one sends anymore. It smelled like ink and dust and old dreams. I brought it home, cleared the small table near the window, and spread it open. The corners curled upward. The coastlines looked hand-drawn. I traced a path from where I was to nowhere in particular. I wasn't planning to leave, but I liked knowing I could. That night, I circled 3 towns I'd never been to. One had a glass-blowing studio. Another had a wildflower reserve. The third, a bakery that only made one kind of bread, sunflower rye, and closed the moment it sold out each morning. I folded the map and placed it under my tea tray. Not because I needed it right now, but because something inside me had begun to move again that same week. I went to a community center class on container gardening. The instructor was a woman in her 70s with weathered hands and a laugh that cracked through the quiet room like sun through clouds. We planted herbs in old tins. She said rosemary was for remembrance, basil for resilience. I wrote that down. When I got home, I repotted the peace lily into something larger. Its roots had started circling themselves, cramped from all the blooming. I loosened the soil with my fingers, careful not to tear anything. Gave it new space. Afterward, I sat on the porch with dirt still beneath my nails. The sky was the soft pink of a day, deciding to stay a little longer. I exhaled, not relief, just breath. 2 days later, I received a letter from the foundation I'd named in my new will, typed neatly, grateful. They said my contribution would go toward emergency legal support for women over 60. Included a list of recent cases, brief notes. No names. One woman had lost control of her finances after her son claimed she couldn't remember her own birthday. Another had her house signed over while she was recovering from surgery. Another was being kept from her own mail. I read each story slowly. They weren't dramatic, just quiet and cruel. I thought about the phrase they'd used, financial redirection. As if your life were a stream they could reroute while you were sleeping. I wrote a short letter back. I told them I had been one of those stories, almost. Told them they had my support for the rest of my life. I included a line from my notebook. You are not difficult. You are being dismantled on purpose. Remember that? I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox myself. No hesitation. That same afternoon, I received another envelope. This time, hand-addressed. Different handwriting. Inside was a card. Not from my daughter. It was from one of my granddaughters, the youngest. She had always been quiet around the others, the kind of child who drew in corners rather than danced in the center. We hadn't spoken in months. I assumed she'd been told to keep her distance. Her card was simple. Hope you're okay. I miss your stories. I found one of your old letters in my drawer and it made me cry. I don't know what happened, but I love you." I stared at the words for a long time. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted to make sure that when I did, it came from stillness, not sadness. That night, I found the old tin where I used to keep letters and clippings and things I thought the girls might want one day. Inside were notes I'd written to each of them on their birthdays, small things, folded carefully. I pulled hers out on the envelope. For when you need reminding, I added a new note and sealed it again. In the morning, I walked to the post office. Mailed it to the return address on the card. No extras. No explanation. Just a gesture. If she wanted to find me again, she could. But I wouldn't chase that chapter of my life. The chasing, the waiting, the proving had ended. What remained was cleaned out. Later that day, I opened the map again. This time I circled one town. Just one. It's the one with the wildflower reserve. I called Brenda and asked if she'd water my plants while I was gone. She asked how long I'd be away. I said I didn't. "No," she said. "Good." I packed a small bag, a notebook, a sweater, the map, diamonds, not to wear, but to carry, a symbol, a reminder. Before I left, I placed one thing on the windowsill beside the butterfly photo. A tiny sign I found at the garden center. It read, "You are not too late. Nothing is lost. Begin again." And I did. The wildflower reserve was quieter than I expected. No crowds, no tour groups, no children trailing behind adults with plastic binoculars. Just a narrow path cut through the tall grass, a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "Welcome. Let things bloom as they please." I parked beneath a crooked tree, left the map on the passenger seat, and stepped out into the stillness. It smelled like sage and warm soil. The air was thick with birdsong and the low rustle of plants brushing against each other in the wind. I walked slowly, not to take it all in, but because I didn't want to miss what was mine. That's what I'd come here for. Not healing, not peace. Just space. Two. A few minutes in, I found a bench tucked between two patches of goldenrod. It looked like it had been carved by hand, slightly uneven, soft at the corners. I sat, took out the thermos from my bag, poured a little tea. The warmth spread through my palms. The scent of cardamom rose gently from the cup. I hadn't said goodbye to anyone before I left, because I wasn't leaving behind anything I needed. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic exit, just a slow, steady walk away from what had tried to reduce me. And now, here I was, sitting among wildflowers that grew without permission. I took out the small notebook I'd packed. Not the blue one, a new one, pale green with clean pages. I opened to the first and wrote only one line. "Story is mine." That was all it needed. I leaned back and let the sun find my face. A bee drifted past. A woman in a straw hat walked by on the path and nodded to me, that quiet, knowing nod women give one another when we see something strong resting beneath the surface. I nodded back. I stayed for hours, walked without measuring the distance, sat on fallen logs, let my fingertips trail over lavender stems. There was no need to speak, no need to explain, even to myself. Later, when the light began to dip, I made my way back to the car. The air had cooled. The crickets had begun their evening song. I paused before opening the door and looked at my reflection in the glass. It wasn't the same woman from the courtroom or from the UH table. It wasn't even the woman who sat alone at UHS, alone at her kitchen counter with a blue notebook and a bruised heart. It was someone else entirely, not hardened, not bitter. Just whole. And if I could leave anything behind for the women like me, for the daughters who forget too soon, for the friends who don't know how to ask if we're all right, it would be this: you are not the problem, you are the mirror they avoid. And if they can't meet your eyes, it's not because you're fading, it's because you still shine. When I returned home that night, I didn't unpack everything, just the lily which I placed on the kitchen table now in full bloom. And the green notebook, which I set beside it, waiting for whatever came next. I made myself soup, played old music, danced just once, barefoot in the hallway, one hand in the air, laughing softly at the way my hip popped, like it always does. I didn't think of her, not because I had forgotten, but because she no longer defined the weight of the room. She was a chapter, a lesson, not a destination. I poured a glass of wine and stepped outside to the porch. Sky had turned velvet blue. One star blinked above the tree line. I raised my glass, not a toast, not a proclamation, just a small, quiet moment of acknowledgement. To all the women like me who kept too much for too long, to every sentence we didn't say because we were afraid it might sound unkind, to every part of ourselves we stored in drawers marked later, and to the freedom of opening those drawers, pulling everything out, and deciding what gets to stay. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you stayed with me until now, thank you. I'll leave you with two other stories I think you'll love.